we are going to be joined, as always, on Wednesdays by our sister Nomiki Konst for Solidarity Wednesdays. She'll be joining us momentarily as well. We'll be joined by Dr. Carl Mack, always bringing it and holding it down for us. This morning, we are going to continue to keep our eyes on what's happening in Ukraine. We are now approaching day 14 of the Russian-Ukraine war, with over 2 million refugees have already fled the nation. I'm joined this morning by Taisa Semenova, who is a national reporter for the Kiev Independent. First and foremost, a solidarity with you and everyone in that region, particularly the Ukrainians. How are you this morning, all things considered?
Thank you. I'm currently in Poland in safety myself, and I've seen at the border that Poles were extremely welcoming to fleeing Ukrainians. And Poland has accepted already more than 1.2 million Ukrainian refugees. And at the Polish side of the border, many volunteers provide Ukrainians with water, food, warm clothing, anything they need. And more than 500,000 Poles joined a national-wide Facebook group to support Ukrainians, to find them accommodation, to find them a job, to provide them with anything they need so they easily adapt. But I'm concerned that the UN thinks that the number of refugees will grow at least twice. So over the time, probably the support will decrease. However, I'm hoping that's not going to happen. That's not going to be the case. And now the reaction of ordinary Poles is, I think, is not quite what Putin expected when he thought that Ukrainians would be met with, hatred, or they are going to be not welcomed, as we saw this with previous refugee crises in the EU. But reality is quite the opposite.
Right. I wonder if that was a miscalculation on his part, or was he being fed the wrong information, or did he really believe in the propaganda campaign? And I say it that way because of reports from Russian soldiers who, once they got into these regions, were treated and called fascist. It seems as though the propaganda may have been pretty successful domestically, but the idea of Ukrainians being scary did not saturate globally.
Yeah, that's true. I believe that was the miscalculation. And I think that Putin and his propaganda machine created the reality that he himself kind of fell into. So he lost touch with what actually happens. So when Russian troops entered Ukraine, I think many of them were surprised that they were not greeted with flowers. As many war prisoners, they claimed that they didn't know where they were going. They say that they were supposed to be at some military exercises. But recently, the Security Service of Ukraine published a video where one of the prisoners of war, Russian, he admitted that he knew he was doing what he was doing. He had the task to occupy Kharkiv, the city in east of Ukraine, in 3 days, and he had the task to attack the civilian infrastructure, to fire missiles there, to shoot civilians. And he said that that was the part of the denazification operation, what they claim it to be.
I want to go to this clip of a retired U.S. general on Poland offering fighter jets for Ukraine and the subsequent denial of that by President Biden. Let's take a listen to this.
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Actually, no, there's a clip that we're getting ready to play, and it is of a retired U.S. general on Poland offering to send fighter jets to assist the Ukrainian people. Dwayne, if we have that clip, run that for me.
ABC News contributor and retired General Robert Abrams joins us now. General Abrams was an advisor to former U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel during the last invasion of Ukraine, and more recently was the head of U.S. forces in Korea. The Polish government announced today it was ready to immediately hand over all of its MiG-29 fighter jets to the United States and deploy them to an airbase in Germany. But then late today, the Pentagon weighed in and pushed back, saying that it's up to the Polish government to give these planes to Ukraine, saying they didn't think that Poland's proposal is, quote, a tenable one.
This would be purely speculation on my part, because I agree. I think the announcement by the Poles it's inexplicable, actually, for a number of reasons, and it hugely complicates an intended transfer. But perhaps, and the Poles have been great partners, but perhaps by passing them, to the United States in Germany gives the Poles a veiled sense of plausible deniability that it was not a direct transfer to the Ukrainians for fear of Russian retaliation. I don't know. It's pure speculation because it's really unbelievable to think that they would move those aircraft from about 400 miles from Ukraine to 1,200 miles from Ukraine. It's almost crazy. There is a way, by the way, if the planes were sent to Ramstein Air Base and then moved. I think the Ukrainian military is capable of exfiltrating some Ukrainian pilots. They could be flown by NATO aircraft to Ramstein, check out the aircraft and so forth, and then they could be flown back. Although it's at the edge of their legs, I think. They'd probably need extended leg tanks, fuel tanks, external fuel tanks to be able to make it back. But I think that's all doable. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It would probably take a week or so to turn this around. But it would help out the Ukrainian Air Force.
We're joined by Dr. Carl Mack to expand this conversation. And again, we're joined by Taissa Semenova, national reporter for the Kiev Independent. I wanted to play that clip in full context because of the conversation of the no-fly zone, the different scenarios, the different strategies that are being concocted, potentially including some of these fighter jets. Can you tell us a little bit more about that proposal, much as you know about it? Taissa, if you would.
I would say that Ukraine indeed needs more aircrafts, and the discussion for the no-fly zone, Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky has been pleading for it since the day one. And I personally believe that that needs to be done urgently. Because the civilian infrastructure continues to be attacked every day. War crimes are being committed every day. And Russia needs to be stopped immediately. While we're so grateful for the economic support we're getting and sanctions, there's still no much reason to believe that this is going to stop Putin. And as for nuclear threat, that I know that many Western observers are worried that in case of imposing a no-fly zone, then Putin will launch nuclear attack. I think that would be not the case. I think that he uses this threat just for the blackmail, for what he believes would force West to be political capitulation. I don't think he gone completely insane. I think that saying that would be at least underestimating the enemy. And I believe he understands that nuclear power doesn't understand where the border lies between Ukraine and Russia, so he wouldn't damage his own people,
Absolutely. Good morning, Dr. Mack. I'd love to bring you into this conversation. How are you?
Very good. Good morning, Ben. Good morning, Taissa. And Ben, in regards to that, I could not agree with the general more. Just on its face, it appears that, Poland is afraid of the possible retaliation if they themselves give the jets to Ukraine immediately. And as Sister Taissa has stated, this is a critical situation. Time is not on anybody's side. The Ukrainian folks could use those jets immediately. And logistically, it doesn't make sense that if Poland is saying that they want to supply fighter aircrafts to the Ukrainian army, and then want to say, well, let us send them to the United States. And then it gives the appearance that the United States Army, look, we gave the jets to the United States. We didn't give them to the Ukrainian army. I do not understand the sincerity in their proposal. If you want to assist the Ukrainian people, give the jets to them directly. Now, I think part of it is that retaliation aspect is there's been much talk that if the world stands by and allow Putin to occupy Ukraine, as he has done Crimea, then next in line, maybe it's Poland. And then Poland could certainly be the, conspiracy speaking, Poland could be the next victim of this, because now maybe Putin looks at it and says, look, you gave Ukraine jets, so now we want to come after you. So I do not understand the logistics, and nor do I take their offer to be very sincere. If they can't man up, if you will, and directly give those jets to the Ukrainian people and let the whole world know that we are against what Putin is doing, and we have no shame in trying to assist the Ukrainian people.
To that point, Thais, I want to ask, in the response from the global community has been one of stark solidarity. It seems like a lot of rallying around NATO, a lot of rallying international support against Vladimir Putin. But I'm curious as to some of that same propaganda that was present in Russia being present in Ukraine and around the globe and other places. I'd like to know, in your research and everything that you're studying, what elements are still in play in terms of the propaganda, the media elements, because, there was inside help in Ukraine, even if those people have evacuated now. Could you speak to that?
Yes, unfortunately, the power of Russian propaganda is the propaganda is way more effective than the West have ever realized. And for example, in the occupied Crimea, people were watching Russian TV, and I personally spoke to a guy whose mother didn't believe him when he said that he was hiding in shelter from Russian bombs. So he called her to tell her that he was alive, and she didn't believe him because she watched so much of Russian propaganda. And I think that, of course, some people, they are subscribed to Russian TV channels, media outlets, internet media outlets, and those who received information from that sources, of course, they are a little out of touch with the reality. As for propaganda as being spread now, I've seen a lot of articles on how Poles are not happy with Ukrainian refugees' behavior from the Russian side. But I personally talked to many Polish volunteers, and nobody expressed me that. So I'm quite certain this is the message that Russian propaganda is now trying to spread.
Thaisa,
go ahead, Dr. Mack.
Thaisa, yesterday we had a very serious discussion from an African American, from a Black perspective, of what we have heard, and certainly I'd certainly like you to give us insight on it. And what we discussed yesterday was the reports of areas of discrimination against Blacks who live in Ukraine, study in Ukraine, not only in their transportation and trying to be evacuated, but the way that they have been treated at the borders, given that it appears that there was a lot more stringency in allowing them to cross over the borders versus white Ukrainians. So can you give us some insight on that?
I personally didn't see any disrespectful attitude from the border guards. I would have to unfortunately say that I've seen some of that behavior from Ukrainian men who were trying to evacuate their families. They were pushing foreigners away from the border so their wives and children could cross it instead. But as for officials, I personally didn't see that happening.
So you that's one. Go ahead, Ben. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say that's one angle we didn't think about yesterday, Dr. Mack, was, personal individuals at the border who are trying to scramble for their own lives. But go ahead, Dr. Mack, what's your question?
No, so obviously that is an issue that has permeated within our community. And granted that
absolutely,
we certainly want to have support for the Ukrainian people, but it is disturbing when we as Blacks in this country, subjected to some of the most horrific areas of racism and discrimination, find that at a time when this country is under attack, to know that there's any racism or discrimination coming from supposedly allies against Putin as it applies to Blacks. So it's certainly something that we would like for you all to take a look at, and certainly voice that it is a concern for us as Black folks here who are very supportive and very sympathetic to the Ukrainian people. But that means all of the Ukrainian people, our people who are there from Africa studying, and those who have decided to make Ukraine their home.
Absolutely. Thais, if you have an extra moment, we're going to be joined by Nomiki Konst. She joins us every Wednesday for Solidarity Wednesdays. And I can't think of any scenario more important for us to have solidarity around than to push back against Vladimir Putin's push into Ukraine. Good morning, Nomiki. How are you? I'm sorry. I think I have your audio muted. Now. Oh, that it is such as the world of the pandemic still. I wanted to bring you into this conversation, Nomiki, because you and I, we study on a regular basis about the global pan-reactionary movement, of which I believe Vladimir Putin is a key leader. And why it is so important for us to stop Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. And of course, this is important to Ukrainians, but I need this to be applicable to Americans as well. Why is this so important for us?
Well, I mean, it was essentially a declaration of war without openly declaring it. He can't declare it because he might be accused of war crimes, which has been discussed ad nauseum at this point. But I think, to bring it back home in a micro level and what's happening right now and what led up to it, I woke up this morning and on the front page of the New York papers where I live, a New York banker was charged with being an agent of Russia who was heading up the headquarters, I guess, for a Russian propaganda unit in which they have been for well over a decade, almost 20 years, finding ways to spread misinformation, disinformation in the United States to sow dissent, to sow, some sort of chaos, which he's been very successful at doing. And, this is something that I think you and I have talked about extensively on this show, on my show, in person. It's hard to know, but we have definitely seen that there's been messaging that goes against progressive and liberal, basically the roots of liberalism. If we are liberals, if we are actual liberals by definition, we believe in democracy. And it doesn't just mean democracy here, it means democracy everywhere and giving people the right to choose. What Putin has done effectively is just remind folks, this is a guy who imprisons his enemies, kills his enemies, including journalists. And, whether it's shutting down information in his own country right now because he doesn't want Russians to understand what he's doing, I think they know. I don't think it's going to work, given that, everything is shut down. This isn't just another invasion. This isn't just another Crimea, which was horrific. Yeah. This is something much larger because they can't, many Russians can't even, use MasterCard and Visa and Apple Pay and all of the things that people have gotten used to doing over the years.
And
Thaisa, I want to tie, go ahead, Dr. Matt.
Ben, let me get this question. Thaisa, and this is both to Thaisa and Nomiki. From your perspective, do you think that at this level, after 14 days, that there's enough evidence to cite Putin with war crimes? I get that war is ugly and dirty from its onset, but have there been specific actions that you all could point to that if the world were to charge him with war crimes, that they have the evidence to do so?
Excellent. Absolutely. I think every Ukrainian now who faces the firing shots, firing missiles on civilian infrastructure now films this, and we send it to the email of the judge in Hague. I know that my family documented a lot of this, and many other people document this. So I'm pretty sure that even though it's been less than it's been 2 weeks, we already have enough evidence. And I would like also to add to the previous point, why winning the war would be important for America. President Biden himself portrayed Russia's war against Ukraine as a defiant struggle between freedom and tyranny. And this is not the war one can afford to lose, even though the battlefield is very far away from your homes in Ukraine. And have you noticed how many times Putin mentions the West in his statements?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, which is why we're bringing so much attention to it. We had a chance to speak last week with Ukrainian member of parliament, Inna Sovsun. And one of the things that stood out to me, Thaisa, was the look on her face and the exasperation in her voice when she said that she never believed Ukrainians, at least a portion, never believed that he would actually do this. Could you speak to that reality and how that has changed and what the Ukrainian people, what their gaze is now? Where is their focus now as a united people?
Our primary focus, of course, is to defeat our land and to save our sovereignty. But as for people, what they're thinking about, Of course, they are full of hatred to Russians. I'm not going to lie. It's been growing exponentially day by day. And people are just fighting for their freedom, for their lives. They want this war to be over. There's not much I can say about it.
Yeah. Listen, I go ahead, Nomiki. Go ahead.
I was just going to say this is a really important point too. I think, especially for those of us who are millennials, we've seen the implications of really bad foreign policy over the last 20, 25 years, and what it, what the ramifications are. This is Putin trying to exercise some sort of post-Soviet fantasy of Russia taking over the world, but it's not based in reality. And a lot of experts have said that he's been, especially in the last few years under COVID, increasingly paranoid, a little bit out of his normal state of mind. And so when you do this type of action on Ukraine, and it's all in his mind about unifying Russia again, what she just said was really important. They're really angry at Russia. It's having the actual adverse effect. It's actually giving people more of a need and want to be part of a NATO alliance, which she does not want, to be part of the EU, to be part of a stronger democracy. And I just don't see this ending well for Putin. But the problem is that he's not in a stable state of mind, that if he sees the writing on the wall, which who knows if he is right now, maybe that is where the nuclear aspect is such a concern, is that he's not in a stable state of mind.
I don't think there's any reason to believe that. And the U.S. I've just seen the report that the U.S. doesn't believe he's gone crazy too. I know that it's a convenient version to think, and I would be happy to think so, that he just got completely crazy and all Russians don't support him. But it's just not true, In reality, we are dealing with a collective Putin that includes current Russian leadership, oligarchs, and yes, some ordinary Russians who support the regime, who actively support the regime, or silently. And I can only sympathize with the minority who's against what's happening, and they are now facing the threat of 15 years in prison for just calling the war a war. But I would say, I personally don't see much prospect of, for example, oligarch revolt, because we have to understand that nowadays most of them are not just businessmen, but they are Kremlin bureaucrats who need to consider whether toppling Putin could lead to their own demise.
Thaisa, let me ask you a question, Thaisa. In all of your experience, I was pleasantly surprised to understand the number of people in Russia who have protested Putin's invasion. Yeah. In your lifetime and in your reporting, have you ever seen under the Putin regime any type of outcry to the number of almost 6,000 Russians protesting any decision that Putin has made?
Of course, the situation is extraordinary, and people are risking their lives to go protest. So I honestly admire those Russians who are brave enough to go and express their will to stop this bloody slaughter in Ukraine. But to be honest, it's hard for me to say that 6,000 Russians is a large number. I myself was a part of Euromaidan, the revolution we had in Ukraine, and we were like 2 million people in Kiev with a population which is way less than Russian. We're protesting against the president's decision. President Yanukovych, if you remember him. Yes. And people were killed there, but we still were standing there protecting our beliefs. So,
yeah. No, Thaisa,
that's why he's clamping down, right? I'm sorry.
Right. Listen, thank you so much for spending this amount of time with us and helping us to understand a little bit more of the nuances of what's happening there. We are standing in solidarity. If there's one thing that I heard throughout this whole conversation is the fact that the need for a no-fly zone in order to protect civilian structures, and the fact that there has been enough documentation for war crimes that Putin must be held to account. Just get the last word before we go, because we're going to go to a break, and Nomiki, if you could stay for a moment after the break, we can go a little bit more into Solidarity Wednesdays. But I just would like to, what can we do? Because honestly, across the ocean here, we do feel helpless, as if there's not much that we can do other than scream at the top of our lungs. But one of the things we are going to scream for is the no-fly zone, and we'll let the politicians figure out how to accomplish that. But if there's anything else that we can do on this side, please let us know. And thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me. I would say that you can do is not to forget about what's happening in Ukraine, because, unfortunately, any tragedy, no matter how awful it is, over the time, it's just not on the front pages anymore. It's not discussed every day on news. So people just tend to forget and, get bored with this. So I would ask you to continue talking about and continue asking your government to impose a no-fly zone.
Absolutely. Thank you, Thaisa Simonova of the National Reporter for the Kiev Independent. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to go to a quick break. When we come back, we'll still be joined by Nomiki Konst, Dr. Carl Mack, and we'll begin with On the Clock right after this short break. Welcome back, everybody. We're on the clock. No Georgia Fort this morning. She is out saving the world, doing what she does. We are joined by my sister from another mister, Nomiki Konst, and as always, Dr. Carl Mack. I wanted to pick right back up in the conversation specifically about the no-fly zone, which has been up for consideration. Of course, there's fears, Nomiki, and I want to come to you first. If something like this were to be enforced, because a no-fly zone has to be enforced, specifically, if it's enforced by the United States, then that presents a huge potential for this escalating out of control. Speak about the risk of the no-fly zone.
Well, it would, as far as I understand, it would have to be enforced by NATO. And NATO right now, this is such a great education moment for activists on the left to understand NATO, which has been a topic of conversation before. NATO's not necessarily in its strongest state pretty much since the Iraq War. There's just been a lot of bickering between countries that have very different agendas and politics right now. When Libya, when the actions in Libya occurred, NATO was not in agreement. You had Italy and France on different sides. So even though U.S. does obviously have a very strong voice, I think under both Obama and Biden, they were reluctant to overplay their hand and really a reaction to how Bush's foreign policy was led. So this would have to be NATO enforced, NATO agreed on. And as of right now, I think because so many different leaders in Europe understand the existential threat, they are right there versus us being overseas, it is much more sensitive that if you do a no-fly zone, it could escalate things. It could make this war, it could encourage other actors who are working and helping fund Putin right now. Let's not forget, he has allies, other autocrats around the world who might be seeing this as an opportunity to do similar things. So it's, I think the concern right now is that it's going to escalate the war. Of course, I think the other aspect of this is NATO and the U.S. in particular are really urging Zelensky to take the lead, which is why they're willing to provide arms but not put boots on the ground, even though he has asked for support. Because again, our foreign policy and the foreign policy lessons post-Iraq war are to not invade. Is it perfect? No. There have been a lot of mistakes. Because you don't put boots on the ground doesn't mean that drones are the best option. But I think that folks need to understand that this is the mindset of where, at least the Biden administration, I understand they're coming from. But, I will say in response to the last interview, while Putin, there are mixed reports about his mental state, he is still an insane person, and he's always been an insane person. Whether or not the stress of COVID, age, he's being incredibly isolated. He has not been around all of his staff and allies, doesn't trust people. I mean, those reports I think are accurate, and that can lead to a lot of yes man syndrome. And if there are men around him who are encouraging him to behave this way, having a no-fly zone could possibly tick him in a certain direction, and the risks are just way too significant.
I want to expand, and actually we have on the screen Sister Georgia Fort. I spoke too soon. I thought you were out saving the world, which you are always doing. Good morning, Sister Fort. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning. I'm doing that later today. So
that's not a problem. Listen, Georgia, I want to pivot to because this is Solidarity Wednesdays, and we still have Nomiki Konst with us from the first segment. I want to pivot to the teacher strike that's happening in Minneapolis, because one of the number one things that we talk about during these Wednesday shows is the solidarity around workers and teachers being on the front line. Could you give us an update on what's happening with that strike?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a pleasure to have you as well. So thank you for being with us. The teacher strike, we're on day 2 now in the city of Minneapolis. Teachers are going to be rallying at the state capitol because there's actually a $9 billion surplus. So educators are going to the state capitol asking the governor why exactly some of those funds can't be allocated to classrooms, can't be allocated to more mental health services. Right now, we know that there's a student ratio of, I think, 1,000 students. There's only 2 social workers per 1,000 students. So wow. Inside the classrooms during this pandemic, kids are in need of more mental health services, more mental health support. And educators are standing up and saying, we're not going back in the classroom until we can get the funding to improve that ratio, class sizes, wages, all of these different things that are impacting not only the quality of life of the educators, but also the quality of learning that they can provide for our students. And so there has been some criticism from community members because obviously classrooms are shut down pre-K through 12th grade in the city of Minneapolis. So parents, once again, are stuck trying to figure out where can their kids go during the day while they have to work, right? But on the other side of that coin is teachers who are saying that our students are not getting a quality education. Yesterday, Ben, we saw thousands of educators and supporters who took to the streets to demand that their requests be heard. And again, when you look at the $9 billion surplus, I mean, the money's there. So we should really be asking ourselves, what is the resistance about here?
We have a clip. David, Dwayne, run the clip that gives us this update. I think it may be Voices, if I'm not mistaken, Georgia. We took it directly from your coverage of this strike. Do you want to tell us what this clip is, or we could just run it?
Yeah, so if it's from yesterday, thousands of educators were outside in Minneapolis rallying and basically just kicking off day 1 of this strike.
Let's take a look at that.
In this country, the richest country in the world, we are paying ESPs $24,000 a year. View is that everyone is standing for a living wage for our least paid workers. How is it that they try to talk about finding ways to deal with recruiting black and brown teachers, and then they have you on strike doing nothing about having a competitive salary? How dare they? You are the ones that bring opportunity and justice to Minneapolis. The fact that they have you on strike, look, I'm from New York and I'm Jewish. There's a Yiddish word. The fact they have you on strike is a shanda. It's a shanda. You want to be in schools with our kids. Then you need the fairness to actually do the work. Smaller classes, mental health support, and living wages so you can stay in Minneapolis without working 2 or 3 jobs.
and band, lots of dancing. I mean, the energy was high, but you heard it summarized there very clearly. There's 3 requests: livable wages, educators saying that they shouldn't have to go work 2 and 3 jobs. They shouldn't have to go live way in the suburbs outside of the city of Minneapolis to be able to afford a quality of life, right? They should be able to live in the neighborhoods that they're serving in. More mental health services for our students and smaller class sizes. They've made their demands very clear. And I think that all of those requests are very reasonable. I think that those requests also are very attainable when you look at the fact that we have a $9 billion surplus in the state of Minnesota. So why can't those funds be allocated to teachers in Minneapolis?
Yeah. And so what I'd like to ask is, what have legislators said that $9 billion surplus is to be used for?
That's a great question.
Yeah, you know, there's been, I think, some different proposals, but they haven't landed on anything yet. I will say I am getting emails almost every single day from the governor's office about a tour that they're doing across the state of Minnesota, allocating $300 million to public safety. So they're meeting with police chiefs in every city. They're meeting with police chiefs in every city across the state. They've made a huge emphasis on the cities that are, you know, more rural area. They've gone to greater Minnesota, but I'm getting emails, updates about this public safety campaign where they're allocating $300 million to these different departments and meeting with the police chiefs and other stakeholders in their cities to find out what did they need money for. And so, you know, I thought that was interesting on the backdrop in the wake of George Floyd here in this state where, you know, we are supposed to be the epicenter of this global movement for police accountability. And we have a surplus of funding, yet and still the governor is doing this campaign that aligns with Biden's message during the State of the Union address to fund police. And so, you know, I think when we see our children not having access to the resources that they need for quality education, we see their educators not having access to wages for them to have a livable salary, right? We here in the state of Minnesota, and this is parallel to what's happening in other cities too, right? Or other states. And so, I mean, but we have to ask ourselves, the old saying, you know, put your money where your mouth is. And I think the state of Minnesota and other cities, states that are experiencing similar crises, it's clear where our leaders' priorities are.
And Georgia,
Nomiki, let me, Brother Matt, real quick, only because Nomiki is going to have to get out of here. I want to get Nomiki in here to speak about this, because we've seen these teacher strikes really be a flashpoint in the recent years. I remember all the strikes that we saw in Wisconsin. With the time that you have left, Nomiki, could you just talk about that in context of the broader solidarity and tell everyone how they can reach you and support your work?
Thank you. Well, it's always, I love Wednesdays. It's a great way to start the day. And even when the news is so dire right now, it's inspiring to be with comrades, right? You know, I think what's really important, and we've talked about this before on the show, teachers are the largest public sector workers in the country. They are the strongest union force in this country. They are the largest donors, the unions are the largest donors to the Democratic Party. I can't believe, you know, Randi Weingarten, who was speaking there, I have seen her give that speech in different forms in so many different communities, whether it's a small room in Long Island or in Puerto Rico. I've seen her give the speech, or in Arizona. Teachers really have been on the front lines of these attacks and survived because they're so strong. I mean, think about it. If the average teacher is making $24,000 a year and staying a teacher, they are doing it because they love the work that they're doing. I think we, as progressives, really need to step up I don't know how, but think about how we can support our teachers, because Republicans, the far right, the Koch brothers have been attacking them at the state level for decades now. But during COVID, they used every single scenario to really put teachers against the wall and make them out to be the demons. But they're what keep our communities together. We would not be the country we are today if we did not have public education. And I really feel for you guys. And I think every Democratic lawmaker really needs to understand. And maybe that's where we as folks can stand in solidarity and really challenging our Democratic lawmakers to make sure that teachers are protected and paid.
Absolutely. Nomiki, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you on these Wednesdays.
See you today, later.
Good morning, sister.
Yeah, I'll see you in a few. Thanks so much for joining us.